Hello, and welcome to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast, your serving of wine trends and passionate people beyond the bottle. I'm Lauren Buzzio, the managing editor here at Wine Enthusiast. And in this episode, contributing editor Matt Kettmann talks with winemaker and old vine advocate Ian Brand on California's wine growing history throughout the Central Coast in order to highlight the area's current old vine status. Old vines are undoubtedly an it thing in the wine world right now. But why? Well, the answer might not be so easy to define, but we'll hear some of the reasons why wine growers, makers, and consumers alike are attracted to these unique and distinctive bottlings. From classic brands and sites in San Jose and Santa Clara Valley to a younger generation of winemakers that are rediscovering old vine hotspots, particularly around the Monterey and San Benito counties, we'll give you the lowdown on which producers to watch and what bottles to seek out to experience the Central Coast's can't-miss wines made from old vines. But first, a story from our sponsor, Wente Vineyards, about their Make Time initiative. If the past few months have taught us anything, it's the importance of making time to do what matters. Whether that's taking a few minutes to connect with loved ones, a few hours testing a challenging recipe for a wonderful family meal, or a few days to create your new home garden because you've always wanted one. Whatever you do, for yourself or for others, remember that time can rush by in the blink of an eye. And when we take those hours, minutes, or days to do something truly meaningful, what was once a smudge on the calendar becomes a moment of timelessness. For 5 generations, the Wente family has believed in the importance of making time and have seen and felt the joy that ensues from these moments. The Wente team is truly inspired by the happiness and connection created when people make time to enjoy a glass of wine on the tasting lounge patio with friends, or at home sharing stories of the day over a glass of wine. To that end, Wente made its company vision to inspire people to make time for what matters. Because at the end of the day, wine is really about people and the moments you make time to share together and the memories you hold on to. If there is one thing the team at Wente wants you to walk away with today, it's to encourage you to be intentional and take time to create meaningful memories. So take a moment and commit to making time for whatever matters to you. Visit wentevineyards.com for daily inspiration and tips on how you can shift daily routine into meaningful moments. Whatever you choose to make time for, Wente will be here to help make it memorable.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Matt Kettmann, contributing editor with Wine Enthusiast magazine, in charge of covering the Central Coast and Southern California. Today, I'm joined by Ian Brand, the head winemaker and owner of iBrand and Family Wines, which makes a lovely lineup of wines, including Le Petit Paysan, La Maria, and a number of other brands. He also consults with wineries all up and down the Central Coast and is expert, in my mind, on a lot of the old vines of the Central Coast, which have coming from, somewhat forgotten vineyards. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Ian, before we dive into that, tell us a little bit of your background and how you got from the East Coast to the West Coast and got into winemaking.
Sure. After school, I was a pretty good vagrant and didn't do a lot in the way of work for a while, and was making my way across the country for the third time and ended up with an old 71 VW microbus and drove it over the Sierras and landed in Santa Cruz and ran out of money in Santa Cruz and didn't have a job. And first gig I got was in the lab at Bonnie Doon. And from the lab, I went to the cellar. And from Bonnie Doon, I went to Big Basin Vineyards, where I did vineyards and the cellar up there. And that's in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And in 2008, we moved down to Salinas and started our own project. Eventually, we got our own winery facility and have been doing our brands and some custom work and consulting on vineyards and generally trying to elevate and showcase this region.
Great. And so when did Randall Graham at Bonnie Doon has worked with some older properties over the years. When did you kind of figure out that old vines were a thing even? And how did you start finding them up in that neck of the woods?
Yeah, that I notice a lot of things working over the years in different vineyards of working with vineyards. And one thing you notice is that sometime around 20, 25 years old, the vineyards start showing a different level of depth in terms of flavor. There's a little more, I think, because of the larger root structures, balance in the way they ripen. And then that level of individual character and depth continues to grow and evolve as the vineyard gets older. And when we moved down to Salinas, I really wanted to make sure that what we were making was wine that was of the place. And so I've spent a lot of time learning the vineyards and the properties and the histories and kind of connecting dots in this region. And I came across a lot of vineyards that were 30, 40, 60 years old, 100 years old, and began seeing it as a part of our job, as being a conduit and kind of providing that continuity between the history of the region and then what comes next.
And it turns out you were kind of in a hot spot for that, especially if you start talking about the old vineyards of San Jose, Santa Clara Valley, and then down into particularly San Benito County and that whole Cienega Valley, where a lot of wine history for California really kind of started, right?
Well, it's interesting history. We should probably go into that. What's great about the Cienega Valley is, for various reasons that we'll get to, it was lost in time. And so you have a style of planting and varieties and vineyards that are survive, that are healthy, that are vibrant, and that were just kind of behind this shadow, kind of behind the shadow of Almaden. So it's a really interesting place, really great wine growing soils. But the important in understanding how all these vineyards got there and what's there and why it's there, you kind of have to tap into the 170-year history of commercial wine growing in California and go back to the nurseries and the early industry around San Jose and the peninsula, where your family's from, Matt.
Yeah, I'm a fifth generation San Josean. I've lived in Santa Barbara for 25 years now, but my family is from the east side of Santa Clara Valley, kind of the Evergreen area. There's actually a Kettmann Road there that is not much to speak of, but it's there. And they were shepherds back in the 1850s. The Kettmann name's actually German, but he was Catholic, and so he married Irish pretty much all the way down. So my bloodline's pretty much Irish, but we were there, and we must have been there. I mean, we were there in the 1850s, and right. So the kind of first California winery boom, if you don't count the Franciscans bringing in mission grapes, which we'll talk about a little later too, I think. But that was kind of the 1860s, 1870s, right? I mean, there was some nurseries in San Jose that were bringing vines in from France and propagating them, and then kind of dispersing them all around that region, right?
Yeah, well, the first commercial vineyard in the Santa Clara County was actually up, I believe, in that Evergreen region. And it was planted by Louis and Pierre Pellier, who were the owners of one of the two major grapevine nurseries in San Jose at the time, the other one being William Pfeffer. And then Pierre Pellier's daughter married Pierre Mirassou. And so the origins of the Mirassou name and that expansion were out in the Evergreen region. And then the other early vineyard was down the Blossom Hill region. And that was what became Almaden near Guadalupe Creek. And Charles Lefranc and Paul Masson and everyone else came out of that Almaden lineage.
Yeah, and those names, I mean, Almaden is a region of San Jose, a little bit more of a Tony, nicer region than where I grew up on the east side. But I had a lot of friends from Almaden, and then I grew up, right by the old Mirassou vineyards. I mean, I remember riding my bike through vines. Now they're all houses. The city made them save the winery structure because it's a historic building, so they did that. And then I remember this is when I got into college, going back and visiting my parents who still lived in that area then. And I think La Rochelle had taken it over at some point. And I remember going wine tasting in the old Mirassou building, which was pretty cool. But now Then came another wave of intense development there, and the building is still there, but it's basically, the last time I saw it, it seemed like it was covered in some sort of protective warehouse looking thing. I mean, there's no more romance to it. They used to try to do a farmer's market there. I don't think that happens anymore. It's just kind of a little bit of a sad situation, unfortunately, which is, like a lot of, well, really the whole Santa Clara Valley, that was with the considered the most fertile ground on the planet. And then it's now all houses, which is understandable, but a little bit sad. And so anyway, so yeah, I grew up in that region and riding through those vines, and it was an interesting place. We were on the kind of the fringes of the suburban development at that point, and now it's pretty much developed all the way you can up until the hills there. But so so those vines were then sent all over the place. I mean, that's what started kind of Santa Cruz Mountains type wines, right? And those vines obviously made it down south a little bit into Monterey County. How do those vines spread, as far as you know?
Well, the next place that really developed after those early vineyards in the 1850s was around the Stevens Creek area. And the Stevens Creek area was the center of premier wine growing in California at that time. And I think a great deal of it has to do with all the limestone in the soil around Stevens Creek. That's where the old Kaiser Permanente quarry is. It's right below Montebello and Mount Eden.
Both of which, obviously, Ridge makes the Montebello, and that's a fantastic wine. Has been a classic California wine for decades. And Mount Eden is a extremely well-known brand making Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, and Cab. I'm not sure how old their actual current vines go back to, but they're on that, storied Paul Masson to kind of Martin Ray earth up there in the mountains there. And so vines started, I mean, basically the soils were just good for vines in that region.
Yeah, and you began having Californians going over to the premier regions of France, especially Bordeaux, and taking cuttings from the best vineyards pre-phylloxera. So you had vines from Lafitte and Margaux that were then being propagated, Massal selections that were then being propagated in the San Jose area. And so there's some really interesting Cabernet genetics in these older vineyards that are not reflective of the clones out of Napa, the Beringer clones, or like the 337s or newer clones from France. They're just a totally different cluster morphology and style.
Were they effectively suitcase cuttings brought in without records, or were they actually being imported in a registered way?
In 1860?
Yeah.
It's a lot of kind of story and hearsay where they came from. There is a story that after phylloxera hit some of these first growth Bordeaux Chateau, they actually came back to the San Jose area to get cuttings from these vineyards to take back to replant their vineyards. It's a good story. I can't verify it. And the oldest remaining vineyard of those is the small La Cuesta parcels that are up in Woodside, that are kind of in backyard areas just west of the 280 that Woodside Vineyard still makes.
Okay, so Woodside. So those are, you're thinking those go back to 1860s, 1870s?
No,
Is the vine?
those vines are from like the 30s and 40s, as far as I can tell. But they're maybe the 20s, but those are kind of the oldest remaining of like that thread. Everything else has been pulled out.
Those are Bordeaux varieties,
Bordeaux,
or Pinot, or what are they?
Bordeaux, Cabernet.
Mm-hmm. Have you had the wines?
I have not had La Cuesta for a while, but I have had some, and they're kind of very vintage dependent.
Mm-hmm.
The Pinot goes back to Almaden, Paul Masson, and the Pellets did bring in Pinot, and then Paul Masson got better clones, and you got the Mountain Winery, and they started working on sparkling wine, Almaden and Paul Masson.
And I mean, there's a couple ways to bring this conversation a little bit further south. One is that Almaden, became a massive. I mean, many of our listeners probably remember huge jugs or boxes of Almaden in your parents' refrigerator. I certainly do. It became one of the biggest brands, I want to say, in California history until you get into maybe the modern, more conglomerate eras. And they moved a lot of that wine growing and production, or probably all of it, down into the San Benito County. But a slightly more fascinating, for me at least, connection is that you mentioned Pfeffer being one of these nurseries. And so there's this grape that's called Cabernet Pfeffer, which is Pfeffer, that's grown at the Enns Vineyard in the Limekiln Valley. Its own fascinating history behind that region, where I've hung out with you there. And I recently had the Serre, which is Nicole Walsh's brand. She makes a Cab Pfeffer that I was just like, it's just an awesome, zesty, and indeed peppery wine. I mean, Pfeffer means, I think, pepper in German or some language. But those are two ways to bring it down into that region. But I also want to mention that a lot of this information, I'm sure you're getting to some extent from Charles Sullivan's book, Like Modern Edens, which is just a fascinating, for those who are into wine history, which clearly we both are. It's a fascinating read, and it's all about how the wine industry developed in the Santa Clara Valley. And it's so fun to kind of follow the fingers of what happened there into the modern world. And like, I think you, of all the people, in this, particularly our relative generation, is really kind of exploring that in a very hands-on, experiential way, which I think is cool. So tell us a little bit about how you found your way into San Benito County, and what some of the kind of gems you're finding there are.
Sure. Part of the way I've been looking at this, at the area that I'm working in, is that it's an area that, from a macro level, never quite got figured out and divided up, at least in the modern era. And so there have been various ideas of wines that have popped up. Santa Lucia Highlands, the Chalone, the whole Chalone group in the 70s and 80s, that have made a lot of sense, but there isn't this greater idea of, oh, this style comes from here and that style comes from there. And so I've been trying to look at the various pieces and valleys and canyons and mountain regions, and figure out what works there and what should be planted, and especially as the climate evolves. And in doing so, knowing about that some of these old vine vineyards existed, I wanted to pull the ways they were planted, the varieties they worked with, and some of that knowledge and evolution, and then combine it with some of the more modern ideas of what you should do and plant, and maybe come to a greater synthesis of how we should grow. Specifically, one way to look at it is, when you see modern vineyards, they're all in a vertical true positioning system, all upright. And that's, there's ease of picking, ease of maintenance of vines, but also that leads to increased sun exposure and increased exposure for your various sprays to keep the mildew off. And those were styles of vine growing that were developed in much more humid regions, and much less sunny regions. And so you go back to these old vineyards, and they're kind of this more head trained filtered sunlight that in some ways works better with some varieties. So coming from that, and I started looking at them, and then start getting into the history, and like who planted these vines and why were they planted there, and what was their access to vines, why were they selecting these varieties. And so getting back to Cabernet Pfeffer in the Cienega Valley, that also they began planting that in like 1852 or 1854, and it was a man named Théophile Vachet who started wineries up around the Cienega Valley, and then he and his brother were working had one of the early wineries down in the Los Angeles region, and he was really good friends with William Pfeffer, and so was sourcing a lot of his vines through him. And he had planted what is now the Eden Rift and DeRose properties. So the Cienega Valley is a valley that drains down into Piscinus, and off of the Cienega Valley there are kind of side canes and side valleys, and there are 3 side valleys that are in a row that are planted with grapes. So you have at the far north, you have the old Vachet property, which is now Eden Rift and DeRose, and then you have a dolomite and limestone mine on the hill, and the next property down is the old El Gabalon vineyard, which is now Gemelli and the Wurz property, and then you have Mount Harlan, and then on the south side of Mount Harlan is the Enns property, the Limekiln Valley.
And Eden Rift is I went and stayed a night up there with those guys. They're doing some fascinating stuff. We had a great dinner, which Josh Jensen from Calera came and hung out, and the Waller brothers were there, and I stayed in the Dickinson House actually, which is the old Victorian kind of, I guess you'd say, mansion for back in those days. And they have the Dickinson. I just recently tried the Dickinson block Zinfandel, which is 100-ish-year-old vines, 1900 something. When I taste old vine wines, I often expect a bit more of an earthy, expression, kind of almost like secondary, tertiary flavors that just kind of come out of this, historic vine. And in that case, that Zinfandel is actually pretty sprightly and fresh and fruity, which is I found kind of fascinating for an older vine block there. But before we actually even go deeper south, I do want to not forget the Grenache and the, I believe, Zin from Besson Vineyard, right up in kind of the Gilroy and Morgan Hill area, also, which is southern Santa Clara Valley. Before you get into San Benito County, which is more Hollister and south, that's a fascinating vineyard. I've been out there with the Biraquino guys before, and those are crazy old vines. Tell us a little bit about those vines, because I know you make some wine from there too, right?
Sure. So in the 1870s and 1880s in California, you started having a lot of immigration especially from northern Italy. And those immigrants spread out over the Santa Cruz Mountains, and which were largely logged at that point, have since regrown, but were actually fairly bare, and then down through the Santa Clara Valley. And the collections of grapevines that they planted were a little bit different than the grapevines that were planted in the 1860s, 1870s, involved a lot more Zinfandel and a lot more of the kind of the hardier and productive grapes. And so you see a lot of Zinfandel, a lot of Mataro and Grenache and Carignan surviving the Santa Clara Valley. And most of it is most of the old vines that survive are in the kind of Redwood Retreat, Uvas Canyon, Hecker Pass area. The healthiest of those vineyards are run by the Besson family, which has two parcels. One is about 10 acres of Grenache that was planted in the 19 teens, and then a smaller block of Zinfandel and a tiny bit of Mission that was planted, I believe, in the 1890s.
Need a break from the news? We're very excited to tell you about an all-new podcast from our partner site, Thirsty Nest, the first wine and spirits registry for the modern couple. This podcast is called Can I Buy You a Drink? And on it, founder Jackie Strum will interview wine and wedding industry up-and-comers about their very own meet-cute stories and their path to finding the one. It's a dreamy break from all the scary headlines that will warm your cold, cold heart. So check out Can I Buy You a Drink? From the Thirsty Nest team on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or any other podcast platform you prefer.
What just on a consumer level, we're hyped on these kinds of old vines, and a lot of winemakers are, and I'm sure Psalms are, and that sort of thing. What do consumers jive on this too? Are they into these historic vines? Is that something that you think we're fascinated with and they're not, or do you think they're into it too?
I think they're into it. I think consumers are fascinated with the story. I think they're accustomed to quality being higher. I mean, what's difficult is that old vines doesn't have a strong definition in the market. For me, and this comes from asking Morgan, Twain Peterson, and Tegan Pascalacqua what their definition would be. It's vines over 50 years old qualify as old vines. So if I'm making a wine and the average vine age is over 50, that would qualify as an old vine wine. But you have, in the Napa Valley, if it's over 20 years old, they're talking about their old vines. And like 20 years old in the Central Coast is maybe it's starting to get started to think about getting old.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen winemakers with vines that are 15 years old put old vines on the label, and come on, guys.
Older than our new vines.
Older than our new vines, yeah. And I think that up in the Willamette Valley, they're guilty of a lot of that too. I mean, the oldest Willamette Valley vines are, I think, from the late 60s, but you see vines from the late 80s, early 90s called old vine Pinot Noir.
Is there any like legislative movement to codify that, or not really? It's just not being looked at.
It's just not really being looked at. California winemakers are not like that heavily into rules, compared to our Eastern or our European counterparts that seem to just love codification and rules. Um, so there could be some value in doing that. The benefit is right now there are there are a handful of wineries and winemakers that are very taken by the old vines and are working hard at their preservation and conservation. And there's the Historical Vineyard Society, who is working hard both on the genetic side and on the preservation side to keep these vineyards in the ground. Mike Carlisle, Bedrock, um, Turley, and Sandlands, Deegan. Yeah.
That's a fascinating website. For anyone who hasn't looked at that website, you should go to that. It has an entire list of what they're considering old vineyards, and a pretty detailed bit of information on each of the vineyards. I was looking at it in preparation for this talk, actually, and I was like, "Oh man, this is a website I could spend all day on." I had to get off of it because I felt like I was going to be there too long. But it really, they're doing really good work. They're really into it. It's fascinating, and I mean, I could see them. They're not necessarily into rules either, but I could see that kind of work leading to somebody going, "Hey, maybe we should at least make some rule, like 50 years. Why not?" There'd be a lot of opposition to that. But let's move down the coast a little bit. Monterey County has a very established winemaking tradition these days, but it doesn't. There's not a lot of super old vine stuff in Monterey County, is there?
Yeah, that's true. So you had the development in the Cienega and in Santa Clara in the 1800s. You had some development in Paso Robles in the 1920s. But by and large, the Central Coast began getting planted out in the 1960s. So in the early 60s, you had, I think, the third or fourth generation of Mirasus seeing Monterey as a frontier to move into. And they were followed by Palmasan and Wente. And then there was and then you had some vineyards going up into the mountains around. There were some tax breaks that were created for planting vineyards in the late 60s. And that's when you saw the old Durney property go in and the old HMR estate that Adelaida has now in Paso Robles and the Bates Ranch. And so you saw more extensive planting of those kind of boutique or uh, remote vineyards in the late 60s because of that tax break. And you also saw in the 50s and 60s, when Almaden moved down to Cienega, you saw more planting around San Benito County in the 50s and 60s. That's also when you get down into the Santa Maria Valley when the Nielsen Vineyard was planted, and then in the early 70s through Santa Barbara County.
Right. I hung out with you at the old Durney Vineyard in Carmel Valley, which is kind of in the middle of nowhere, but really fascinating planting. Now owned by the Massa family, right? And they're trying to bring that back, and that's what, late '60s.
The first blocks were planted in 68, 69, and then there's some stuff from 71, 78 into the 80s. It was kind of progressively planted from cuttings. But this is kind of part of the interesting piece. So when I went back and tried to figure out where those cuttings from, the best story I could come up with was quote unquote, we got them from Grandma Mirasu. So the Mirasu family that was married to that was part of the Pellier family that brought a lot of the vines down to Monterey County was also passing these Bordeaux vines that ostensibly go back to the 1850s, 1860s in the San Jose region up to this vineyard in Carmel Valley. And there's some continuity in kind of the morphology of like the clusters. And so ostensibly the genetics between what's going on there and like the old stagecoach block on Bates Ranch, which was also a 68, 69 planting. And then
And where's Bates again?
Bates is up Redwood Retreat. It's the canyon just north of Hecker Pass. So if you head up Watsonville Road near the old Besson Vineyard and the old Fortino Vineyard, which you take a left about 3 miles up and head up Redwood Retreat, and that's where like the Vanumatagi Vineyard is, and Mary
And you
Carter
make some wines from there, right?
from Bates. Yeah, Bates is a great property. It's an amazing Santa Cruz Mountain kind of historic property, and it's got a lot of verve and panache.
Right. So let's shoot down to Paso, which is I know a good amount about Paso. I mean, there's the Uberoth Vineyard, which is a Turley owned property. So Tegan Pastelacqua, the winemaker there, and one of these strong proponents of the historical vines, makes some pretty massive Zinfandel from that old vine as well. And there's the Ducey Vineyard, which you actually see when you're driving on 101. It's just right there on the right. It actually used to, I think, sprawl. I think it's on both sides of 101 actually. So 101 probably ripped out, X number of acres of vine from the old Ducey Vineyard there. But some fascinating stuff in Paso Robles too. And then you mentioned the HMR vineyard, which this was shocking to me when I learned this. But from what I have heard, the first Pinot Noir planted, and maybe you couldn't say the Central Coast because there might be some stuff that goes back earlier up in Santa Cruz and that area, but definitely the first Pinot Noir planted on the southern Central Coast was that HMR vineyard in the Adelaida district in Paso Robles. And Paso Robles is not known necessarily as a cooler climate region, but if you get into those hills to the west, it is actually can be quite chilly. And I recently had both the HMR vineyards, Pinot Noir and Chardonnay from Adelaida Winery, and those are fantastic, really interesting wines. It is the Pinot is not like a zesty, sprightly version. There's a bit of a richer profile to it, but
whether it's with rosé techniques or orange wine techniques or Pinot Noir techniques, one person, the build up, and then one person figures out, oh no, what we need to do more whole berry and open tops and cold soaks like this, and then that style proliferates until someone else figures something else out, and then that style proliferates, and it's just a set of techniques that work their way through the winemaking community.
Well, and it's that pendulum too, right? It'll swing both ways. It swing, very deeply into richness, and still is there for a lot of people. But that's kind of I see in my tasting, swinging back towards lightness and brightness, and someone's going to push that probably a little too far for most people's taste, and then that's going to start to swing back as well. What I've been finding fascinating, we've been focusing mostly on Central Coast, more or less northern, what we would call northern California. But once you get into Santa Barbara and then you go south and you actually run into this small little town called Los Angeles, which also used to be, just like San Jose, the center of winemaking for Southern California. It's like we planted grapes all over these places that were, eventually sprouted suburban developments. But there are still some parts of LA that have old vines there, particularly Rancho Cucamonga area. Again, some of these vines planted late 1800s, early 1900s, and most of it's housing, but there are some vineyards down there that still exist. There's one I've had a couple different wines from recently. One was a Municipal Winemakers. This guy Dave Potter, who I don't know if you know, Ian, but you guys would hit it off. He's a really cool guy and it's super into the history. He's actually from Cucamonga originally, and so he makes a Grenache from Hofer Ranch, which is a fascinating wine. Very lighter in style, still super fresh, but it kind of has some of this savory, I don't know, history flavor to it, if you will. And then Mikey Guini from Scar of the Sea, who you probably do know, he makes his wines across the border are fascinating, but he also is from Cucamonga originally as well. And he makes a Hofer Ranch that I just had the other day. And it was one of these wines where I tasted it and immediately thought of hiking through the Santa Barbara Mountains here, which has nothing to do with Cucamonga, but that kind of chaparral, dried sage smell and flavor was just like booming off of the nose and palate of that wine. And it was, it's almost one of those wines. It's like it transports you in a way. It was not super complex or super rich or super deep, but it was just I don't know, just something that transported me and made me really fascinated. And I always wonder, like, is that like, is history talking to me through these vines? I mean, do you find when you're tasting these older wines from older vines, are there times where you're like, wow, I feel like I'm tapping into some ancient wisdom here? I mean, is there any kind of magic of that for these vines to you?
Wow, you're asking about some woo-woo stuff right now. Uh, the I don't know if I've ever thought about it like that. I mean, first that flavor profile you're talking about, the kind of the dried grass and sage and chaparral. I've come to call that the Central Coast Garrigue. Like I feel like that's our version of herb de Provence, right? That if you're coming from these drier mountains from south of the redwoods, you really need to be capturing like the sunlight and the effect of sunlight and those aromatic kind of oily herbs, and that's just a great deal of our sense of place. And some of the old vines do capture that better, but I've also seen that wonderfully in younger vines out of the Chalon region. Um, I think that anytime you work with a vineyard, you're working with everyone that's worked with that vineyard, both in terms of contextualizing your wines, but also in terms of how that vineyard's been planted and maintained. That there are reasons that with these old vineyards 100 years ago, they picked these varieties and they began this style of pruning and that spacing. And the wine you make is kind of the sum of all those decisions in all those years. And so, yeah, you are tapping into a different set of knowledge. And I think that's the most interesting part, that for instance, in Pinot Noir in the Central Coast, a lot was planted out in the 90s and early 2000s. And it's the same sets of clonal material, it's the same rootstocks, it's the same ideas of what a planting should look like and spacings. And there's a great deal of sameness in the results. And part of getting into these old vineyards is there's not just the big root structures in the history, but there's an individuality that's kind of come with time. Sort of like listening to a later Dylan album, that where it might be a little strange for some folks, but like you can really get into the depth of that experience and songwriting, and that's really exciting from a winemaking perspective, because there's just a lot more. There's a lot more to tap into and to grab onto when making these wines. A lot more of a story to elicit, rather than just a repetitive set of techniques.
Right. Um, I was just talking to a winemaker who makes a brand called Cavaletti, which is actually mostly a Los Angeles based brand. And they've found some old vines here and there around LA, and there's actually quite a resurgence right now in LA as far as realizing these vines exist and embracing them. And he actually was telling me they just found this vineyard up in the Lake Hughes area, which is kind of if you're going up the Grapevine on I-5 and you hang a right on 138, which is through the Antelope Valley. It's actually the way I like to go to Mammoth if I'm going skiing or snowboarding. But it's up in the mountains up there, and they found this old vineyard that was next to a school. Someone just told him about it. They're like, "Hey, I used to go to school at this place when I was a kid, and there was these vines." And he went up there and he found it, and it was at one point a pretty sizable thing. He thinks he can revive about 2 or 3 of the acres. I think he doesn't even know what the grapes are yet. He says it doesn't look like Zinfandel. Can't really tell, but they're thinking it goes back 1920s or earlier. Is your sense that are there any things left to be found out there? Are there some old vineyards that are in, I don't know, people's backyards or on ranches that have been closed to the public? I mean, is there more to find, or do you think we found the old vines that we're going to be looking at for the years to come?
In our area, there are a few backyard places. There's the South Hart Grenache Vineyard in the Piscinus area, which I haven't seen a South Hart labeled wine. It usually comes out through Beaulieu or Beringer since 2007, but there is a 3-acre Grenache block back in there. There's a lot of, not a lot, there's a handful of things from the 50s, 60s, and 70s that are still not necessarily undiscovered, but not tapped and showcased in the way that they should. Um, and unfortunately, there were several of those that got pulled out in Monterey in the last 5 years, because there wasn't the level of interest in them. And so those are some of the things that I'm trying to create wines around. Like we have that are particularly on Cabernet, which is now average vine age of over 50. And that the reason we built that wine is because of two vineyard blocks in San Benito County, from the early 70s and the late 50s that were not that couldn't really find a home. They weren't producing the raw material and at the productivity that made them something that like Gallo or Constellation would go after. And they were too large of a block and not sexy enough for your boutique winemakers to get into. So I had to figure out a wine at a particular volume that would work in order to make those vines sustainable. And
Yeah, I just had that. I mean, I really enjoyed that wine too. I don't think you've seen the scores yet, but I gave it a pretty good score, and just thought it was kind of a fascinating, take on Cabernet. Really showing, I would say some of that Central Coast Garrigue in that wine too. And it's I don't know. I mean, cheers to you for fighting that fight, because I mean, it is especially for grape growers, it is an economic situation, right? I mean, a lot of these old vines aren't pumping off as much fruit as a tightly spaced VSP vineyard would do. They're widely spaced, they're bush vines, they're old, so they do get tired. I mean, do the economics work out if you can? I guess if you can pump that fruit price up. I mean, what is the situation, the reality in that situation?
There are a lot of tough discussions with growers, and you have to figure out what their costs are and what their average yields are, and what sustainability is. And with each, we're interested a lot in older vineyards because this provides our connectivity, our history, and they produce better wines. And these are the wines that are going to cement, both the reputation of a region and our reputation. But you can't go into a vineyard and say, well, your neighbor's getting $1,400 a ton for Chardonnay, and therefore this should be $1,400 a ton. Because this older Chardonnay is, like you said, because of larger spacing, because of age of vines, maybe only producing a couple tons an acre. And so you have to look deeply at what you can do in the market, because generally these older blocks are 8, 10, 14 acres. They're not like your little 2-acre block that you can pull 2 tons of and make your boutique wine. And so like figuring out what that sustainability is. And we tend to allocate more of our bottle price to fruit cost, because we really feel strongly that part of our function in this region is making sure these vineyards stay in the ground and stay healthy and improve in health, that the health of those vineyards is invested in, so that whatever generation comes after us has these gems to work with and play off of. But it's not an easy undertaking by any means.
Right. If you were to go back in time and put Ian Brown back in the 1860s, 1870s, or even early 1900s, if we want to be a little bit more realistic about what vines would still be left, what would you have planted and where?
Uh, well, I am very high on Grenache in general on the Central Coast. I think it's a well adapted vine to the area. I think that some of these older Cabernet material is pretty exceptional. I would have done a lot more aromatic whites in the Salinas Valley, and probably down in like the Edna Valley as well. Um, yeah, and Trousseau actually does really well. When you go back to what Théophile Vacher planted at the old Eden Rift property, there's Trousseau and Pulsard and Pinot Noir back in the 1850s out there, and I think that was actually a pretty good match.
Great, man. Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been fun. I can't wait to go pop some Old Vine wines today and give them a whirl. So thank you, Ian Brown. This has been, I think, a good conversation. I hope listeners enjoy it. And, let us know if you want more. We could go deeper. We could go deeper into these conversations. And hopefully that will help save some of these vineyards even more. So thanks for your time, Ian.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Wine Enthusiast Podcast. There's no doubt that there is so much to explore and consider when it comes to old vine wine, including those from California's vast central coast. The history behind the vines themselves is often fascinating and lends a taste of that history in each glass of wine made from those storied sites, while the depth and unique character of these bottlings offers even more pleasure and perspective with every sip. We mentioned a lot of areas and producers to keep an eye out for if you're interested in diving deeper into the Central Coast's world of old vine wine, including recently reviewed selections from iBrand and Family, Turley, Bedrock, and more. Be sure to visit winemag.com/podcast for ratings and reviews from these producers and others discussed today, as well as additional links to learn more about the old vine news and wines from around the world. Subscribe to the Wine Enthusiast Podcast on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you find podcasts. And if you liked today's episode, we'd love to read your review and hear what you think. And hey, why not tell your wine-loving friends to check us out too? You can also drop us a line at podcast@winemag.com. For more wine reviews, recipes, guides, deep dives, and stories, visit Wine Enthusiast online at winemag.com and connect with us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Wine Enthusiast. The Wine Enthusiast Podcast is produced by Lauren Buzzio and Jenny Groza. Until next episode, cheers.